Moma is the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, just for some context. They're hexagonal. The ubiquitous asphalt pavers in New York City parks, they're hexagonal. Having been born and raised in New York City, there are some of my earliest recollections of public spaces as a child. I recognized them intuitively, even if I had never before realized they were hexagonal, perhaps because I knew them before I knew what a hexagon was. I was revisiting the pavers on a walk through Central Park during a business trip in 2013. It was the first time I'd spent any time in Manhattan in 25 years. I was looking forward to this trip, as if I was being reacquainted with a lifelong friend. When I first arrived, even after 25 years, I experienced an instant, intimate familiarity. The feel of the humidity and the pressure of the sea level air, the smell of the salt water, the choreography and tempo of the New York street tango of pedestrians and vehicular traffic, the approaching and receding noise of the subway passing beneath the sidewalks, and the correlating rush of warm air through the grates of the street as the trains pushed through the tunnels. There was the sight of the garbage put out on the sidewalk, these days in bags rather than in cans in the past. It seemed quieter than what I remembered, not as much clanging, but there was still a cacophony of car horns and sirens echoing in the canyons of the buildings. Voices passed me on the sidewalks with distinctive New York accents in conversations peppered with laughs, exhortations, and expletives. Walking in Manhattan always offered a rich, flavorful, spiked cocktail of discovery and familiarity. I walked along blocks that I did not recall, yet were recognizable if only for their character and feel. Walking by familiar places involved rediscovering them. Same place, different time, new perspective. I made a point of walking by many familiar places. The lobby of the Empire State Building, St. Peter's Church in the lower level of the Citibank Building, the Great Hall of Grand Central Station, and along the East River looking toward the United Nations and the apartment complex where my mother lived in the 1980s. These places were psychological touch points that offered glimpses of the past in instants that traversed decades. During these walks, being in the present meant experiencing the presence of the past. It produced preternatural feelings of stimulation, an aha moment, a comfortable ease of place, or the dissonance of something familiar lost in time, all experienced simultaneously. On the last day of my trip, after a morning walk, I had some spare time before I needed to head to the airport. I decided to take advantage of the opportunity to go to the Museum of Modern Art across the street from the hotel where I was staying. I had 75 minutes. Yes, a ridiculously compressed time to visit a world-class museum, but I was determined to take advantage of the opportunity. I arrived as the museum was opening, and there was already a line of visitors waiting to pay the admission to go inside. I used this time to plan my strategy. I grabbed a map of the museum and scoped the sequence of galleries I would visit based on their descriptions. I was among the first wave of morning visitors that flooded the museum. As the crowd mingled and meandered, I was struck by how many people were on their cell phones. As I went up to each floor, it was necessary to be alert to the phone zombies as they occupied conspicuous spaces without being cognizant of their impedance of others. It was as if their very essence of being was sucked into the void of their phones. It was weird. The first set of galleries I visited were decidedly underwhelming. Was I let down by deflated expectations? Was it a recurring coincidence of finding things that did not generate any interest or excitement? Or perhaps the art really was merely pretentious or poorly presented. A striking disappointment stirred agitation and amplified my urgency to find something notable or meaningful. Plowing through clouds of distracted patrons, posing for selfies, texting, and bellowing phone conversations did not help. I finally came across a docent and resigned myself to ask for directions. She patiently and respectfully listened to me as I explained where I'd been and my question of where I might find something of interest. Perceptively, she suggested a gallery with some 19th century modernists, Van Gogh's Starry Night, and Munch's The Scream. I thanked her and headed straight for that gallery. When I entered the gallery, I was immediately struck by the paintings. Miro, Picasso, a Cubist salon. The magnificent works that immediately captured my attention. The clutter of noise and distraction from the busy crowds receded as I walked further into the gallery and became immersed in the works. Eventually, I found Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, featuring the distinctive image of a clock draped over a tree branch, a painting that I had seen on a prior visit. But this was a bizarre experience. I used to like Dali, and in particular this painting. On this occasion, however, it did nothing for me. Nonetheless, I sensed the experience of my first impression from 30 years ago simultaneously with that day. Two impressions, years apart, like a 3D image without the glasses, as if layers of the image were lifted off the canvas, separate but the same. An experience of the dimension of time, same experience, two times, different, living twice at once. I moved on. I was able to focus on the paintings. The noise and distraction of the incidental crowd receded. There was just me, the paintings, and others who shared a similar immersion. No cell phones, selfies, or group chats, just us. I floated along and found Munch's The Scream. It's a fascinating painting of an image of a woman standing on a bridge with her hands to her ears and her mouth open with the silent expression of a desperate scream. I was first struck by how small it was. I'd always had this sense of it being much larger, like the woman's sense of overwhelming despair. It turns out it was not the actual painting, but a considerably smaller pastel of the same image that Munch had done later. But what was even stranger than the diminutive pastel study of the scream was its hideous frame. It was in a style that was completely incongruous with the drawing itself and was relatively massive, as if the frame was muffling the scream, like it was saying, "Shh, this is a museum, don't scream." I chuckled and turned the corner, and there it was, Van Gogh's Starry Night. I instantly recognized it from the innumerable prints that I had seen on posters and in books. The swirling night sky in bursts of color depicting the glowing moon and stars. But more than just a rendering of an image, in person the painting is entirely different. Van Gogh's brushstrokes lift the paint off the canvas, revealing the depth of the explosion of color. As I stood in the presence of the painting, I thought to myself, wow, this guy Van Gogh has a lot going on in his head. Not sure what it is, but it's a lot. For a brief moment, I stood mesmerized in front of the painting in an almost hypnotic trance. Not only was I sensing the expression of the painting, but it almost seemed that I sensed the presence of Van Gogh himself. There was nothing else in the moment but the art and the artist, transcending time and space. That moment passed, and I wandered further into the gallery to another room with Monet's Water Lilies. I'd always recalled this as a painting of a bridge over a pond. But this installation was a series of floor-to-ceiling canvases surrounding the room, one of many variations of the theme of the flower garden at Monet's Gavarni home. I quickly became immersed in the presence of the flowers and the plants, depicted as gently undulating colors and pixelations that created the sense that I was no longer in the museum in Midtown Manhattan, but in a French garden with a summer breeze and rustling of leaves. I could almost feel the embrace of the warm summer air of late 19th century France brush across my skin. I exited the gallery and drifted out of the museum. Somehow I was aware of the passage of time and the need to return to the hotel to collect my things and head to the airport. Once out on the street, returning to the normal of the day, I passed a colleague on the way back to the hotel. I briefly wondered what they were doing there and what a coincidence it was to see them in New York when I remembered that I was there with them on the business trip. For those transcendent moments in the museum, I'd been transported to a different place, a different time, and I was emerging into the pedestrian reality of the present, returning to the linear dimension of now. I flagged down a cab, headed to the airport, and in a few hours was back home in Chicago. But in a way, even after the years that have since passed, I am still there, in the streets of Manhattan, the museum, alive with the paintings, and ambling along the ubiquitous hexagonal asphalt pavers of New York City parks.